The Prince with the Golden Chain. Once upon a time, there was a prince who wanted to set out and see the world. His father, the king, had a golden chain forged around his neck and gave him some money as well. Then the prince said goodbye to his father and traveled away. Towards evening, he came to a town where the bells were ringing. And when he asked what the ringing of the bells was about, he was told that a poor man had died. But he still owed 10 coins, and the person to whom he owed the money would not allow the poor man to be buried unless someone came and paid the money for him. The prince felt pity for the poor man, who had been standing in his coffin above the ground for quite a while, and so he paid the coins in his stead. The prince walked alone behind the coffin, and as the coffin was lowered into the ground, the poor man finally found his rest. After this, the prince went on and came into a dark forest, where he met 2 scoundrels who asked him where he was going. Already thinking that those must be thieves, he answered, "I have set out to learn how to steal." "If you want to learn how to steal," said the 2, "you have come to the right place. We understand that very well. Just come with us and you shall learn." Then they took him into their cave, and there were 24 scoundrels together, who also had a princess with them, who they had kidnapped and were now holding captive. Then one day the chief said that they could go out stealing for 3 nights in a row, and whoever brought home the most should marry the princess. When they went out on the first night, the prince went his own way. He stepped behind a tree and untied a piece of the golden chain that he wore around his body. And when the others came back, he had brought most of it with him. He did the same the second night and the third night too. And because he brought home the most each time, he got the princess as his wife. The princess, however, wept so much and was very unhappy that she should have a scoundrel for a husband and live among nothing but scoundrels as well. Then the prince revealed himself to her secretly and said, "Do not cry anymore. I'm not a scoundrel, as you probably think, but a prince, and I will free you from your captivity as soon as possible and travel with you to your father." He was now probably acknowledged as one of the thieves and was given a flute, which he played when he was at home to entertain the other thieves and the princess. Sometimes he even took her for a walk at midday. The chief of the thieves owned a carriage and 4 horses, and had allowed him to drive around in them sometimes, but only very close to the cave, so that they always could see him. Now it happened one day that the entire gang had made a good booty, so they arranged and made a drinking party, and drank so much wine that they all became drunk. The prince, however, had only pretended to drink with them. And when he saw that they all were laying under the tables, he went out, hitched the horses to the carriage, and raced with the princess over the hill, and fell out of the forest, and did not stop until he came to a town that lay to the sea. But they had to cross the sea to get back to their homeland, so they persuaded a ship's captain, who was there with his ship in the harbor, to take them with him. They came to an agreement with the men and went on board of the ship, which was ready for the return journey. When they had now left the land and reached the open sea, it became clear that the captain of the ship was also a treacherous man. He was from the same country as the princess, and the king, Her father had announced that whoever would free his daughter from the hands of the thieves would become king in his stead and have the princess as his wife. And now, the ship's captain had recognized the king's daughter again, and so he secretly made a plan to get rid of her companion who had freed her originally. He has persuaded his sailors that they should bind him up during the night and throw him into the sea, and promised them a good reward if they did so. The sailors were ready, and while he was lying in his bed asleep, they tied him up with ropes and wanted to throw him overboard into the sea. But he woke up, and he begged so much that they would spare his life that at least they gave in and untied him and gave him an old board. Where they put him in gave him old ragged sailor clothes because he was half naked, and pushed the boat out into the sea. He will certainly not betray us, they thought. If he does not starve, he must drown, for the old boat will not stay afloat for very long. When they brought the news to the captain that they had carried out his orders, the princess had to swear a solemn oath that she would never tell anyone in her life what had happened to her, and that someone else has rescued her before, or her life would be in danger. After that, they sailed on and arrived safely on land, and in the town where the princess had come from originally. The captain then claimed to be the man who had freed her from the scoundrels and brought her to the king. The king was very happy to see her daughter, at least. Well, the poor prince, meanwhile, was sailing on the great sea in his boat. He had indeed saved a bit of his money and his food in his pants, but what good would that do to him if he had nothing to eat? He thought he would starve miserably, and had already resigned himself to his fate, when one night the boat struck shore. He jumped out and tied it up, and because hunger drove him, he climbed up a high fir tree to see if he could see a light from there, and thus find people who would give him something to eat. But no matter how hard he strained his eyes, there was no light anywhere near or far. He became quite discouraged again and said, "What good is it to me now that I have fortunately escaped the sea, if I must die of hunger here in the wilderness, or fall into the hands of some scoundrels again? If the waves had swallowed me up, that would have been the best thing for me." While he was still complaining, he noticed that something white was stirring in his boat, which he had left behind on the shore. And when he went closer, it was the ghost of the poor man, for whom he had paid the 10 coins, so that he could be buried. "Because you have been so kind to me," said the dead man, "and have given me an honest burial, I will now, as a thank you, take you quickly to the city, where the captain is going to celebrate his wedding with your wife tomorrow, if you do not turn up in time." When the dead man said this, he led the prince to the boat, and sailed that same day to the royal city, as far as to an harbor, near an inn, which lay directly opposite to the castle. Inside the inn, the prince asked the landlady whether he could stay the night there, and have a room, and asked for a glass of wine. The landlady, however, looked at him with contempt, for he was still very dirty, and only wore his torn sailor clothes. "Just go on," she said. "This is no inn for people like you. I got the house full of distinguished guests for tomorrow. There is a wedding opposite in the king's palace." But when he placed a gold coin on the table to pay for his wine and the room, the landlady suddenly became very friendly towards him, and showed him to his chambers. Then, the very same night, the prince went upstairs opened the window, and began to play his flute. The princess heard this in the castle on the opposite side of the inn, and from the sound and melody she recognized the man that freed her from the robbers. Then she began to cry loudly, and went to her father and threw her arms around his neck, sobbing, and could not utter a single word. "What is the matter with you, my child?" asked the king. "That you are so sad, and tomorrow is your wedding day." "Ah, dear father," said the princess, "I must never say what makes me so sad. I have been forced to swear to it." "Well," said the king, "if you must not say it, then you must write it down." And he sent for a pen, ink, and paper. Then she wrote down that the man who played the flute in the inn had freed her from the robbers, but that the ship's captain was a deceiver and a false man, and was falsely claiming to be her liberator. When the king read this, he immediately sent one of his servants to fetch the man who played the flute in the opposite side's inn. But when the servant came and asked for the stranger about it, the stranger was very hesitant and said, "If your master, the king, wishes to speak to me, he can come himself. The way from the king to me is no further than the way from me to the king." With this answer, the servant went before the king and told him what kind of a dirty fellow the man was, and how he had spoken so boldly. Then the king persuaded his daughter to put the tramp out of her mind, but the princess would not be satisfied until her father himself went and fetched the man over to the castle. Then the two actually met and recognized each other, and fell into each other's arms, and then they told the king about the ship's captain's loyalty, and how it all came about. The king gave the orders that the captain should be torn into pieces by 4 oxen as punishment. But he married the king's son to his daughter and made him king, and he remained so until he died.